In the vast expanse of the cosmos, where stars shimmered like scattered diamonds against an endless velvet canvas, there existed a realm beyond human comprehension. The universe was not merely a collection of planets and galaxies, but a living tapestry woven with mysteries that defied logic. Among these enigmas stood one figure who had traversed time itself in search of something she could scarcely describe, a purpose, perhaps, or maybe even redemption. She was known across countless worlds as the Alien Queen, ruler of an ancient civilization whose origins were lost to the mists of history. Her people called her Zar'vath, though no translation existed for her name in any language spoken by mortals. To them, she was both revered and feared, a being of unparalleled power whose very presence commanded awe. Her skin shimmered with iridescent hues, shifting between shades of deep violet and molten gold depending on her mood. Eyes like twin galaxies glimmered beneath delicate ridges of bone, holding within their depths secrets older than the stars themselves. Her voice carried the weight of centuries, resonating with harmonics that seemed to echo through dimensions unseen. For 400 years, Zar'vath had wandered the galaxy alone, driven by an insatiable longing she couldn't fully understand. It began as a whisper at first, a fleeting sensation tugging at the edges of her consciousness, but over decades it grew into an unrelenting force that consumed her every thought. At first, she believed it to be a flaw, some imperfection in her otherwise perfect existence. But as millennia passed, she came to realize this yearning wasn't born from weakness. It was destiny calling her toward something greater than herself. She searched tirelessly, visiting worlds teeming with life and barren wastelands alike. On lush jungle planets where trees stretched skyward like cathedral spires, she combed through vibrant ecosystems teeming with creatures unlike anything seen before. On icy moons orbiting gas giants, she braved howling winds and sub-zero temperatures, scouring frozen landscapes for answers. Even amidst civilizations far more advanced than her own, she found nothing that quelled the ache inside her chest. Each failure only deepened her resolve, until finally, after centuries of wandering, she stumbled upon Earth, a pale blue dot suspended in the void, seemingly insignificant yet radiating a warmth that drew her inexorably closer. It was here, amid humanity's chaos and contradictions, that Zar'vath encountered him, a man so ordinary he might have gone unnoticed in any crowd. He lived in a small coastal town nestled between jagged cliffs and restless waves, his days spent repairing fishing nets and navigating treacherous waters aboard weathered boats. His name was Daniel, though to Zar'vath, he was simply him. From the moment their paths crossed, everything changed, for her, for him, and perhaps for the entire universe. Daniel had always been drawn to the sea, its unpredictable rhythms mirroring the restlessness within him. As a child, he would sit for hours on the rocky shore, watching the tide ebb and flow while dreaming of adventures beyond the horizon. Now, as a man in his early 30s, those dreams had faded into quiet routines, replaced by the demands of survival in a world indifferent to grand aspirations. Yet despite his outward acceptance of mediocrity, there remained a spark of curiosity buried deep within him, a yearning for meaning that refused to be extinguished. That fateful evening began much like any other. The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and crimson. Daniel worked methodically, mending a torn net under the dim glow of a lantern hung from the mast of his modest vessel. The air carried the salty tang of the ocean mingled with the faint scent of fish, familiar smells that grounded him even when life felt adrift. He paused briefly to wipe sweat from his brow, his calloused hands moving with practiced ease as the waves lapped gently against the hull. And then, without warning, the atmosphere shifted. A strange stillness settled over the water, unnaturally calm despite the breeze ruffling his hair. Daniel glanced up instinctively, scanning the darkening skies for signs of an approaching storm. Instead, what he saw stole the breath from his lungs. Hovering above the cliffs, bathed in ethereal light, was a shape unlike anything he'd ever imagined, a sleek, otherworldly craft that pulsed faintly, as if alive. For a moment, he thought it might be some trick of the fading sunlight, a mirage conjured by fatigue and solitude. But then it descended, silent and deliberate, until it hovered mere feet above the ground. From the ship emerged Zar'vath, her presence commanding attention in a way words failed to capture. She moved with grace that bordered on supernatural, her shimmering form casting an otherworldly glow across the sand. Daniel froze, caught between disbelief and wonder as she approached him. Up close, her beauty was almost overwhelming. Her eyes held galaxies within them, and her voice, when she finally spoke, resonated like music composed of starlight. "You are the one I have sought," she said simply, her tone leaving no room for doubt. Shock rooted Daniel to the spot. "Me?" he managed to stammer, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. "I'm just nobody." But Zar'vath shook her head, a gesture imbued with such certainty it silenced further protest. In that instant, Daniel felt something stir within him, an inexplicable connection, as though threads invisible to the eye had bound them together long before this encounter. And though fear lingered at the edges of his mind, overshadowed by confusion and disbelief, he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her. Whatever this was, whatever she wanted, he knew his life would never again be the same. As the days turned into weeks, Zar'vath became an inseparable part of Daniel's world, her presence transforming the once familiar landscape of his coastal town into something extraordinary. She accompanied him on his fishing trips, standing silently at the bow of his boat as though communing with a vast expanse of water stretching endlessly before them. Her gaze often lingered on the horizon, as if searching for answers hidden within the shifting tides. When they returned to shore, she would walk beside him through narrow cobblestone streets lined with weathered cottages, drawing curious stares from townsfolk who whispered behind cupped hands about the luminous stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. Despite her regal bearing and undeniable otherness, Zar'vath adapted remarkably well to human customs, or at least made a valiant effort. She learned quickly how to mimic gestures of politeness, nodding graciously when greeted by shopkeepers or offering tentative smiles that softened her otherwise imposing demeanor. Yet there were moments when her true nature shone through, betraying glimpses of the alien queen she truly was. Once, during a particularly boisterous evening at the local tavern, someone accidentally spilled ale onto her shimmering robes. Where others might have reacted with irritation or embarrassment, Zar'vath simply extended a hand, palm upward, and watched as the liquid levitated off the fabric before evaporating into thin air. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on her in stunned awe, but she merely inclined her head as though nothing unusual had occurred. Daniel found himself caught between two worlds, his simple, grounded existence and the cosmic mystery embodied by Zar'vath. At times, he struggled to reconcile the ordinariness of his daily life with the surreal reality of having an extraterrestrial monarch shadowing his every move. Yet there was also an undeniable allure to her company, a magnetic quality that drew him in despite his reservations. They spent hours talking late into the night, seated on the creaky wooden porch of his cottage as the ocean roared in the distance. She spoke of distant galaxies and civilizations unimaginable to human minds, her voice weaving tales so vivid they seemed to transport him across the stars. In return, Daniel shared stories of his childhood, of summers spent chasing crabs along the shoreline and winters huddled around crackling fires. Though their lives could not have been more different, they discovered a surprising commonality in their mutual longing for connection, a desire to bridge the chasm between isolation and belonging. But it wasn't just conversation that bound them together. There were quieter moments, too, when words weren't necessary. One afternoon, as rain pattered softly against the windows, Daniel taught her how to bake bread, a task that required patience and precision, qualities she possessed in abundance. Together, they kneaded dough until their hands were dusted with flour, laughter bubbling up as she attempted to shape loaves that inevitably collapsed under their own weight. When the final product emerged golden brown and fragrant from the oven, Zar'vath regarded it with pride, declaring it a triumph of creation, before taking a bite that left crumbs clinging to her chin. It was in these small, intimate exchanges that Daniel began to see past her formidable exterior, glimpsing the vulnerability beneath. Yet for all the joy she brought into his life, there was an undercurrent of tension that neither could ignore. Zar'vath's devotion to him bordered on obsessive, her unwavering focus unsettling at times. She rarely let him out of her sight, trailing him like a shadow whether he was hauling crates at the docks or simply fetching supplies from the market. If he ventured too far from her line of vision, she would appear suddenly, her expression unreadable but tinged with something akin to panic. Daniel tried to reassure her, explaining that humans needed space to breathe, but she dismissed his protests with a wave of her hand. "Space is irrelevant," she said firmly. "What matters is proximity, to you." The weight of her attachment pressed heavily on Daniel, though he hesitated to voice his discomfort. How could he explain to someone who had searched for him across centuries that her constant presence sometimes felt suffocating? He wrestled with guilt, knowing she had sacrificed so much to find him, yet unable to suppress the creeping sense of unease that gnawed at the edges of his mind. Still, he reminded himself of the wonder she had introduced into his otherwise mundane existence. The way she made the stars seem closer, the universe less daunting. Perhaps, he reasoned, this was simply the price of sharing his life with someone so profoundly unique. And so they continued, tethered together by forces neither fully understood. Zar'vath remained steadfast in her conviction that Daniel was the key to fulfilling whatever destiny had led her to him, while he grappled with the duality of feeling both honored and overwhelmed by her unwavering attention. Their bond deepened with each passing day, yet it was clear that the path ahead would not be without challenges. For now, however, they moved forward together, navigating the complexities of their relationship against the backdrop of crashing waves and endless skies. As weeks bled into months, the peculiarities of Zar'vath's behavior began to ripple outward, affecting not only Daniel but the entire community that surrounded them. The townsfolk, initially intrigued by the mysterious woman who had seemingly materialized from nowhere, grew increasingly uneasy as her fixation on Daniel became impossible to ignore. Whispers spread like wildfire through the narrow streets and bustling markets, fueled by sightings of her hovering protectively near him wherever he went. Fishermen muttered darkly about bad omens while mothers hurried their children indoors whenever she passed by, her luminous form casting an eerie glow that seemed to pierce through walls and closed doors alike. The strain of living under such scrutiny weighed heavily on Daniel, who found himself caught between defending Zar'vath and appeasing the fears of those he had known his entire life. He tried to downplay her actions, assuring anyone who would listen that she meant no harm, but skepticism lingered in every sidelong glance and hushed conversation. Some accused him of harboring dangerous secrets, while others pitted him, convinced he must be bewitched or coerced into compliance. The tension reached a breaking point one evening when a group of men confronted him outside the tavern, their faces flushed with anger and alcohol. "She doesn't belong here," one of them spat, jabbing a finger in the direction of Daniel's cottage, where Zar'vath waited patiently inside. "Mark my words, she'll bring ruin to us all." Daniel clenched his fists, fighting the urge to retaliate. "You don't know her," he snapped, his voice trembling with frustration. "She hasn't done anything wrong." But his protests fell on deaf ears. The men dispersed reluctantly, muttering threats under their breath, leaving Daniel standing alone beneath the cold glare of street lamps. That night, as he lay awake listening to the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore, he realized the situation was spiraling beyond his control. No matter how hard he tried to mediate, the divide between Zar'vath and the townspeople only widened, threatening to tear apart the fragile balance of his world. Meanwhile, Zar'vath herself remained largely oblivious to the growing unrest, her singular focus on Daniel rendering everything else secondary. To her, the villagers were little more than background noise, inconsequential figures whose opinions held no sway over her mission. Yet even she couldn't entirely dismiss the hostility directed toward her, nor the toll it took on Daniel. She noticed the weariness etched into his features, the way his shoulders sagged slightly whenever they walked through the marketplace. It troubled her deeply, though not because she feared rejection. She was, after all, accustomed to being both revered and reviled, but because she hated seeing him burdened by conflict. "Why do they resist?" she asked him one evening, her voice tinged with genuine confusion. "Do they not see that my intentions are pure?" Daniel sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "It's not about intentions," he explained gently. "People fear what they don't understand. And you," he hesitated, searching for the right words. "You're unlike anything they've ever encountered. They need time to adjust." Zar'vath frowned, her iridescent skin flickering faintly with agitation. "Time is a luxury we may not have," she replied cryptically, though she offered no further explanation. Instead, she turned her attention back to the horizon, her gaze distant and contemplative. Daniel watched her silently, wondering if she truly grasped the gravity of the situation, or if she even cared. For all her wisdom and power, there was a naivety to her approach, a stubborn refusal to acknowledge the limitations of human tolerance. And yet, despite his frustrations, he couldn't bring himself to resent her. Beneath her unyielding exterior lay a vulnerability that mirrored his own, a desperate hope for acceptance in a world that often felt alien even to those who belonged to it. The discord between Zar'vath and the townsfolk reached a crescendo during the annual Harvest Festival, a celebration that had long been a cornerstone of community spirit. This year, however, the festivities were marred by an undercurrent of unease, as rumors swirled about whether the Alien Queen would make an appearance. Daniel pleaded with her to stay away, fearing the volatile mix of alcohol and superstition might ignite violence, But she dismissed his concerns with characteristic determination. "If they wish to confront me, let them," she declared, her voice carrying an edge of defiance. "I will not hide in shadows while they cast judgment." True to her word, Zar'vath arrived at the festival grounds shortly after sunset, her radiant form cutting a striking figure against the flickering lanterns strung between makeshift stalls. The crowd parted instinctively as she moved through the throng, her presence commanding silence even amid the lively strains of fiddle music and laughter. Daniel followed closely behind, his stomach churning with dread as he scanned the faces around him. Many wore expressions of thinly veiled hostility, while others simply stared, transfixed by the spectacle unfolding before them. It didn't take long for the tension to boil over. A burly fisherman named Gregor, emboldened by drink and resentment, stepped forward to block Zar'vath's path. "This is our land," he growled, his voice slurred but menacing. "We don't want your kind here." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, emboldening others to join him. Daniel stepped forward, placing himself between Zar'vath and the growing mob. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Leave her alone." But Gregor sneered, shoving Daniel aside with enough force to send him stumbling backward. Before anyone could react, Zar'vath raised a hand, her movements fluid yet deliberate. A shimmering barrier erupted around her, pulsating with energy that sent nearby lanterns sputtering and extinguished candles in their holders. The crowd gasped collectively, recoiling in fear as the air crackled with latent power. "I have done nothing to harm you," Zar'vath intoned, her voice resonating with authority. "Yet you treat me as an enemy. Why?" For a moment, the square was eerily silent, the only sound the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. Then, unexpectedly, an elderly woman stepped forward, her frail frame trembling but resolute. "Because you scare us," she admitted, her voice steady despite the tears glistening in her eyes. "You're beautiful and powerful and different. And different is something we don't know how to trust." Zar'vath lowered her hand, the barrier dissolving as quickly as it had appeared. She studied the woman for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, her steps measured and unhurried. Daniel scrambled to catch up, his heart pounding as he grabbed her arm. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice tinged with panic. "Where are you going?" "I am leaving," she replied simply, her tone devoid of emotion. "They are right to fear me. Perhaps it is better this way." "No," Daniel protested, gripping her arm tighter. "You can't just give up. Not after everything." Zar'vath stopped abruptly, turning to face him. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, though whether they stemmed from sorrow or anger, he couldn't tell. "And what would you have me do, Daniel?" she asked softly. "Force them to accept me? Bend them to my will? Is that the kind of ruler you believe I am?" He faltered, unsure how to respond. The weight of her question hung heavy in the air, underscoring the complexity of their predicament. For all her strength and resolve, Zar'vath was trapped in a paradox, too powerful to coexist peacefully, yet too compassionate to impose her dominance. And Daniel, caught in the crossfire of her ideals and humanity's fears, found himself questioning whether peace between them was even possible. As the days stretched into weeks following the tumultuous harvest festival, the fragile equilibrium of Daniel's world continued to unravel. Zar'vath had retreated to the outskirts of town, taking refuge in a secluded cove where jagged rocks jutted defiantly against the relentless tide. She spent her days perched atop the cliffs, gazing out at the endless expanse of water as if seeking solace in its ceaseless motion. Though she maintained her vow to keep her distance from the villagers, her absence did little to quell the simmering tensions that now defined the community. If anything, her withdrawal only deepened the divide, fueling speculation and paranoia among those who viewed her as both a threat and a mystery. Daniel visited her often, trekking along winding coastal paths until he reached the cove where she awaited him. Their conversations grew quieter, more introspective, as they grappled with the weight of their shared predicament. "Do you regret finding me?" he asked one afternoon, his voice barely audible over the roar of the surf. Zar'vath turned to him, her luminous eyes reflecting the fractured light of the setting sun. "Regret is a human concept," she replied after a pause. "But no, I do not lament my decision to seek you out. Only the consequences that followed." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Daniel nodded slowly, though he couldn't shake the nagging sense that her answer skirted the truth. He wondered if she harbored doubts about her quest, if the centuries she had spent searching for him now seemed futile in light of the discord she had inadvertently unleashed. Yet whenever he broached the subject, she deflected, redirecting their dialogue toward broader philosophical musings about fate and free will. It was as though she feared confronting the possibility that her journey might have been misguided, or worse, meaningless. Back in the village, life carried on with an uneasy normalcy. The townsfolk avoided speaking of Zar'vath directly, yet her presence loomed large in their collective consciousness, manifesting in whispered warnings and half-formed superstitions. Children dared each other to venture close to the cove, claiming they could hear her voice carried on the wind, while fishermen muttered prayers for protection before setting sail. Even Daniel's closest friends treated him with cautious deference, their camaraderie strained by the knowledge that he remained tethered to the enigmatic figure who had disrupted their lives. Amidst this mounting turmoil, Daniel began to notice subtle changes in Zar'vath's demeanor. Her once unwavering confidence seemed to waver, replaced by a quiet introspection that bordered on melancholy. She spoke less frequently of her celestial origins and instead fixated on the minutiae of human existence, the way raindrops clung to spiderwebs, the rhythm of waves lapping against the shore, the faint scent of salt carried inland by the breeze. These observations struck Daniel as oddly poignant, as though she were trying to memorize every detail of a world she feared losing. "Why do you study these things so intently?" he asked her one evening, as they sat side by side on the cliff's edge. "You've seen wonders far greater than this." "Perhaps," she admitted, her voice soft. "But greatness does not equate to significance. There is beauty in simplicity, Daniel. A truth I have only begun to understand since meeting you." Her admission startled him, not because of its profundity but because of the vulnerability it revealed. For all her power and otherworldly grace, Zar'vath was grappling with questions that transcended galaxies and civilizations. What did it mean to belong? Could connection exist without compromise? And most hauntingly, was love enough to bridge the chasm between two vastly different worlds? These thoughts consumed Daniel as well, though he struggled to articulate them. He found himself torn between loyalty to his community and devotion to the woman who had irrevocably altered his life. Each visit to the cove left him more conflicted, his heart pulled in opposing directions by forces he could neither control nor fully comprehend. Yet despite the uncertainty that clouded their future, there remained an undeniable magnetism between them, a bond forged not by choice but by destiny. Whether it would prove strong enough to withstand the trials ahead remained to be seen. As autumn gave way to winter, the chill in the air seemed to mirror the frost settling over the fractured relationships within the town. The villagers, once united by shared traditions and mutual reliance, now eyed each other warily, their suspicions exacerbated by the lingering specter of Zar'vath's presence. Rumors circulated like wildfire, each retelling embellishing her supposed malevolence until she became less a person and more a symbol of everything they feared: change, difference, the unknown. Meanwhile, Daniel bore the brunt of their discontent, his role as intermediary eroding his standing in the community. Old friends avoided his gaze, shopkeepers served him with curt efficiency, and children whispered behind cupped hands whenever he passed by. The isolation gnawed at him, leaving him hollow and weary, yet he refused to abandon Zar'vath, even as the cost of his allegiance grew heavier with each passing day. During this time, Zar'vath herself underwent a transformation that was as profound as it was perplexing. Her radiant aura dimmed slightly, the iridescent hues of her skin muted as though reflecting the turmoil within her. She spoke less of her celestial origins and more of mortality, pondering aloud the fleeting nature of human existence. "Your lives are so brief," she mused one evening, her voice tinged with something akin to awe. "Yet you fill them with such intensity, with love, with pain, with dreams that burn brightly even when they remain unfulfilled. I envy you, Daniel. You live fully, without hesitation, while I have merely endured." Her words unsettled him, not because of their content but because of the raw honesty they conveyed. It was as though she had stripped away the layers of regality and mystery that had always shielded her, revealing a soul as fragile and uncertain as any human's. He reached for her hand impulsively, surprised by how warm it felt beneath his calloused fingers. "You've endured for centuries," he said gently. "Isn't that worth something?" She smiled faintly, though her eyes remained shadowed. Endurance is not the same as living, she replied. And perhaps that is why I sought you out. Not to conquer or claim, but to learn what it means to truly exist. Their conversations grew deeper, delving into realms of philosophy and emotion that transcended the boundaries of their respective worlds. They debated the nature of sacrifice, the ethics of power, and the elusive essence of happiness. Through these exchanges, Daniel began to see Zar'vath not as an alien queen but as a seeker, much like himself, a being yearning for connection in a universe that often felt vast and indifferent. Yet even as their understanding of each other deepened, the external pressures mounted, threatening to tear them apart. One frigid morning, as frost clung stubbornly to the rooftops and chimneys belched plumes of smoke into the gray sky, a delegation of townsfolk arrived at Daniel's cottage. Led by Gregor, the same burly fisherman who had confronted Zar'vath at the festival, they demanded answers, and action. "This has gone on long enough," Gregor growled, his breath visible in the cold air. "Either she leaves, or you do. We won't tolerate this madness any longer." Daniel stood frozen, his mind racing as he searched for a response. Before he could speak, however, Zar'vath appeared at the doorway, her presence commanding silence. "You misunderstand," she said calmly, addressing the group. "I am not your enemy. Nor am I here to impose my will upon you. My sole purpose is to understand, to connect. If my presence causes such distress, then I shall depart. But know this, hatred and fear will not drive me away. Only understanding can." Her words hung in the air, met with a mixture of skepticism and grudging respect. Slowly, the delegation dispersed, leaving Daniel and Zar'vath alone once more. As the door closed behind them, Daniel turned to her, his expression fraught with concern. "Was that wise?" he asked quietly. "Giving them an ultimatum like that?" "It was necessary," she replied, her voice firm yet tinged with sadness. Sometimes, clarity is the only path forward. Though her resolve impressed him, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that her declaration had set events into motion that neither of them could fully anticipate. The coming days promised uncertainty, perhaps even danger, but one thing was certain: their journey together was far from over. The days that followed Zar'vath's declaration were tense, as the town teetered on the edge of chaos. Some villagers began to soften, whispering about her words and questioning their own fears, while others grew more resolute in their hostility. Daniel found himself caught in the middle, defending Zar'vath to those who doubted her intentions, even as he wrestled with his own doubts. Could she truly coexist with humanity, or was her presence an insurmountable disruption? One evening, under a sky heavy with storm clouds, a group of men marched toward the cove where Zar'vath often lingered. Armed with torches and tools repurposed as weapons, they sought to drive her away once and for all. Daniel, alerted by a sympathetic friend, raced ahead to warn her. He arrived just as the mob approached, their shouts echoing against the cliffs. Zar'vath stood at the water's edge, her silhouette illuminated by flashes of lightning. She turned to face them, unafraid but visibly weary. "You seek to banish me," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil around her. "But I ask you this, what will your actions cost you? Will my departure bring peace, or will it leave a void you cannot fill?" Her words gave some pause, but Gregor stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. "We don't want your riddles. Leave us alone," he roared, raising a makeshift club. Before anyone could act, Daniel positioned himself between them, arms outstretched. "Stop," he cried. "This isn't the answer." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, unexpectedly, an elderly woman from the crowd stepped forward, the same one who had spoken at the festival. "Enough," she said firmly. "We've let fear rule us long enough. If she stays, we'll find a way to live with her. But if she goes, we lose more than we gain." Her intervention broke the tension. Slowly, the mob dispersed, leaving only Daniel and Zar'vath standing together. Rain began to fall, mingling with tears in Daniel's eyes. "Why do you stay?" he asked hoarsely. "After everything." "Because I chose you," she replied softly. "And because, perhaps, you chose me too." In the weeks that followed, the town began to heal. Though distrust lingered, small acts of kindness bridged the gap: shared meals, hesitant conversations, and eventual acceptance. Zar'vath remained a mystery, but no longer a threat. And Daniel, standing beside her as the sun rose over the ocean, realized that their bond was not defined by perfection but by resilience. Together, they had weathered the storm, and emerged stronger for it.